This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design and development from a group of people with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 446, Test-Driven Development. On today's show, we are talking about test-driven development, why it's important, and how it improves development with guest Alexey Korepov. We'll also cover test helpers as our module of the week. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Our guest today is Alexey Korepov. Alex is a full-stack web developer and open source contributor. He's focused on PHP frameworks such as Drupal, Node.js, such as Keystone.js, Vue.js, and DevOps. Alexey, welcome to the show, and thank you for joining us.
Hello, everyone.
I'm Nick Laughlin, founder at Enlightened Development, and today my co-hosts are Martin Anderson, Senior Solutions Engineer at Acquia.
Hey, everyone.
And joining us for the second week, Matt Glauman, Principal Software Engineer at Acquia as well.
Hey there.
And now to talk about our module of the week, let's turn it over to Martin. Martin, what do you have for us this week?
Thanks, Nick. Have you ever wanted an API that could dramatically simplify the process of writing Drupal unit tests? There's a module for that. It's called Test Helpers, and it was created in September of 2022 by today's guest, Alexey Korepov. It has a 1.3.0 version available, which is compatible with versions of Drupal 9.5, 9.4 or newer, right up to Drupal 11. It is actively maintained. In fact, that latest release was less than 3 months ago, and also has security coverage and test coverage, which would be ironic if it didn't. As far as documentation, it does have API documentation linked from the project page. And it has on the project page, as of today, 2 open issues. And they're both officially listed as bugs, but actually fixed at this point, and so will be addressed in an upcoming release. Drupal.org lists it as having 5 sites using the module, but modules or sites can leverage test helpers without enabling it, and this usage is recommended, so that number is actually higher. Now, the test helpers module provides a new container that automated tests can leverage to perform common tasks with much less code. For example, you can create a user or a node with a single line of code in your test, and you can also mock more complex operations like an entity query or load multiple call, again with a single line of code. Traditionally, writing unit tests is more complicated because by design they run without fully bootstrapping Drupal, and that means that your test needs to mock functions or services in the code you're testing, which can result in unit tests being much longer than the code they are written to test. Test helpers also allows your test to leverage existing mocks and stubs for popular services, and the project page also links to the recording and slides for a talk Alex gave about test helpers at DrupalCon Pittsburgh last year if you want to do a deeper dive. So let's talk about test helpers.
I love these types of utility modules. I think it's something I've been thinking, the usage statistics is something I've been thinking about recently because the book module is being deprecated due to its low usage. And so there's been a little bit of discussion about how to measure that. And I'm curious about measuring adoption for a project like this, because like you said, it's kind of like the coder module or a lot of these other ones where like you're supposed to use it, but never on a production site. So it really is not going to report the number of sites using it. But anything that makes testing easier is a huge one in my book.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I definitely would say for the projects that I maintain that getting higher test coverage is certainly one of my priorities for 2024. So I was really happy when I found this as we were getting ready for this show. I was just going to ask Alex, what inspired you to create the module in the first place?
I think the pain of writing unit tests, because when I joined to a project with a lot of unit tests already written, and when I change 1 or 2 lines in the code, a lot of tests start failing. So I started to think about how to simplify the tests, because actually the tests are 10 times, the tests have 10 times more lines than actual code, and in many tests you do the same things. For example, marking the entity query, marking the entity storage, and I started to create traits or reusable libraries inside the project to simplify the things. And then I looked into this and decided why to not create a universal module that can be reused in other projects. And then I started to use the same project module on 2 projects, on 3 projects, and then decided, okay, let's be an open source module because it really simplified things on all our projects. And before it was like 1 day for write the business logic and 3 or 4 days to cover it by unit tests. And this module actually reversed this to writing code and spend less time to covering it by unit tests. And it makes the unit tests more like functional tests because you don't need to mock all the Drupal core functionality that we already know how it works and how it what we can expect in it.
I'm curious if it helps with mocking your own custom services when you inject them in another service, because that's also the kind of thing that takes a lot of effort, right? When you have to create kind of your own mocks for things. I mean, I don't think you obviously you can't shortcut kind of the logic of that service because it's a custom service, right? So you I don't think there's any way to shortcut that, but there's a lot of still boilerplate when you're mocking a custom service as well. Does this have any helpers with that too, or is that no?
Actually, yes. You create just a mock of your service, or you can even initialize your service without mocking. So if it require, for example, entity storage for user and for nodes, you can just initiate it inside your unit test. So you will have a full instance of your service, not the mock of it. And it will work like you write a functional test, but will work in a unit test context with very high speed of execution.
That makes me very happy. Because I have a particular client in mind that I've been thinking about. We've been discussing at a high level implementing some tests, but they have some really complex service layers. So this might actually simplify quite a bit. I have one final question before we move on, because there's a new change coming in core. Actually, it just landed in core yesterday that might affect a lot of tests that you might want to be aware of. And that is because of the new access policy work that Christian's been working on. They've removed the super user one functionality. So user one used to be like the super user that could do anything. And so they removed that functionality. User one no longer has special functionality. My understanding is there's a new temporary trait or setting, so you can say, hey, this test uses super user, because a lot of tests failed when they removed that. So as a kind of a temporary workaround. But I think it's going to shake up contrib quite a bit, because by default it's going to be off. So if you weren't aware of that, you want to be aware of it, because I imagine it's something you're going to want to support since this targets contrib.
Interesting news, but I think it mostly depends, affects functional testing, but not unit test, because for unit test you can create a user with any. But in functional test you also can create user with admin privileges, so it should not be a large problem. But maybe yes, some tests will fail and you will have to rewrite them to adapt to the new change.
I think the main issue is that most tests, not just contrib, because core had the same issue, is they would create a user and then run a test. And because that user was user one, it had all the permissions and they weren't defining the permissions. After this change, creating that user no longer has those special permissions. So you have to explicitly define what permissions it should be testing. So if your module provides a permission, those types of tests are probably going to fail now, because it's no longer super user one.
As I remember, we can use some function like give admin privileges to the user, so we can create user and just add one more line to give it privileges. So just just a simple change in a lot of files.
Yeah, I think that's what's happening. So, well, thanks, Martin. And if folks have any suggestions for future modules of the week, what's the best way for them to provide you with those suggestions?
Well, our listeners have actually been doing a great job of providing us nominations, so I certainly hope they'll keep those coming. And happy to receive those in the Talking Drupal channel of Drupal Slack, or they can message me directly as ManClue in all the Drupal and social channels.
Now we can move on to our primary topic. So, Alex, let's start with, what does the term test-driven development mean?
So it means just a simple thing that you develop in reverse. So starts not from writing a code, but start writing a test that obviously fails, and then switch to writing the actual code to turn this red test into green. And that's it. So just write the test and then write the code that it will make it happy. But actually, it changed your mind to think that you not as a programmer but as a customer. So you describe technical requirements, but not in the text, but as test cases with expectations. So you give some inputs and expect some outputs. So you should prepare some examples of what you're giving and what you want to receive. And this is the test. And then you start writing you're switching to a regular programmer and start to writing the code to please these tests.
So, Alex, why is test-driven development important?
It's important because it makes the tests more abstract and separated from the program code. Because the classic approach when programmers start to write a code and only then start covering it by unit tests, they actually cover not the business logic but the written code line by line. And the created unit tests came depending on each line of the code, and refactoring this code actually quite hard because changing the line will break the test. Even if you produce the same output, the test can fail. But if you write the test without having any code, you will think about inputs and outputs without the exact implementation. That will give you more universal and more stable tests, and you can refactor the function or write it again from scratch. And if it works correctly, it will produce a green unit test.
I'm a really big fan of test-driven development as well. And usually when working with test-driven development, we talk about unit tests. But Drupal is very interesting in the fact that it is very stateful. And we actually have several test suites. We have integration tests, which is like our kernel tests. And then we have system or functional tests with our functional JavaScript tests. Then we also have these unit tests that are build tests that are kind of unit, but also system tests. So I'm curious how those different types of testing suites that Drupal provides tie into your test-driven development workflow.
I think the most easy part to cover to use for test-driven development is some business logic, where you know the simple input and you know what it should give you as a result, and this can be implemented in functional tests. And sometimes in unit tests, because unit tests, when you use a lot of services that, for example, load entity, create some fields, or ask some fields to read from the database, it's actually not the unit test, it's kind of functional test already. But we call this unit test because it covers just a single function or a single class, but depends on the database, on the maybe some API calls and a lot of other things. So if you have some function that you can easily describe what it should do with the input data, it's easy to use TDD. But if you, for example, create some design or move move the buy now button from the left to the right. you can't try the test for it before doing the actual changing the HTML code or CSS. So for this kind of tasks, TDD is not suitable, I think. So it's mostly for some logical work or maybe cron tasks, background jobs, for this kind of things.
Yeah, that's a good approach. That's what we do. The end-to-end test is usually the after effect. That's the one time we do the after. It's like, all right, we see the big picture, and it's like a stability test at that point. Like, okay, if something changes, we want it to break, versus building the test first and ensuring we have the right spec.
Yeah. Just for our listeners to help kind of close these gaps, what are the different can you summarize what the different tests are and what they're accomplishing? Like what their gaps are?
Yes, so we have functional JavaScript test that just clicks click on the virtual browser and check the result. We have functional tests that actually do the same but with less functionality. So some easy tasks that not clicks but do some HTTP requests and or internal calls in PHP. And we have unit tests that also can do the same, call some functions but without browser. And before test helpers, actually, for me it was easier to write functional tests instead of unit tests, because they check the whole functionality that you want to implement, not just a single function that, for example, loads entity or change the value of the field. But in unit test, you should cover a lot of functions that just do nothing, that just do some background stuff and not actually affects the end user results presented to end users. So with test helpers, I started to write unit tests that covers not the specific function, but the whole class or the whole service. So it calls the service and calls some function, function for end user that calls some internal functions, even not private but public maybe, and checks the actual result of the several functions. So we're covering the full class or full service, not the exact functions. This breaks the idea of unit tests a little bit, but actually it simplifies the things and work much better than covering by a separate unit test each small function.
So I'm curious, so to tie in with the different types of tests, what about with code coverage? Now, it just so everybody knows, code coverage can show you, like, it allows you to track that certain lines of code were executed by your tests and shows you how much of your code is tested. It's not always true, because just because code was executed doesn't mean it's necessarily part of the test. And it only works with kernel and unit tests in Drupal, not functional tests. But I'm curious how you incorporate code coverage as part of your test-driven development, or your thoughts on, like, its value.
Yes. So for me, when I'm writing unit tests, I pretty often can give 100% of the coverage, especially with unit tests, with test helpers, because it really can check any line of the code. But actually, 100% of the coverage doesn't mean that the test actually check something. you can just write tests that makes all the function green, but doesn't test the expected result, or test, for example, only success scenarios, but doesn't test the failure scenarios, or doesn't catch some exceptions. So as a percentage of the coverage is not the only thing that should show you how good are your unit tests.
Yeah, I mean, code coverage is, my personal opinion is, it can be used as a tool to see if something got added that didn't get tested at all. The problem is that it becomes a metric by which you're allowed to commit stuff, which means that people just do the workaround where they just force a code path that covers all the lines but doesn't actually do anything. Like, for example, if you run, unless it's throwing an exception, if you just to give a simple example of what we're talking about, if you run a section of code and then just do something like assert one equals one, right? That's going to show green. It's going to show coverage, even if it's supposed to add 2 plus 2 and it's giving you 5, right? If you're not checking the
Yeah.
actual output. And then the more insidious part is just to call out what both of you kind of insinuated. The more insidious part is many times when you're writing these types of tests, especially from the non-test driven development way, you're just testing the happy path and maybe one or two else's that you specifically thought about. You're not testing the what happens if somebody enters a number in the name field. Do things go awry? And that's really the stuff. Those tests take significant effort to consider and put in place. But they're also the most valuable ones because those are the ones that will truly blow up the application. If you already have something in your code to handle a particular situation, you want to make sure it stays handled. That's why it's valuable to test it. But you've already handled it. You really want tests to be able to kind of see what happens when something unexpected comes.
Yeah,
So
and for this, it's crucial to have good code reviewers to check not only
yeah,
the coverage but actually look what is written in the unit tests, because sometimes reviewers just see that all's green and okay.
yep, a- absolutely. You had mentioned that functional tests in the beginning were easier for you, and that the module that you wrote, test helpers, kind of blurs the line a little bit between unit tests
Yeah.
and functional tests. Do you consider unit tests as part of test driven development, or is that just a different type of test, and functional test is the primary TDD?
For me, it's a large part of the test-driven development because I already tried this, and sometimes it's easy, sometimes not. But actually, it's possible to see to imagine what the output of the function will be, and write all the test scenarios before writing the function. And it's even interesting to produce the red test and turning it into green by your code.
Yeah.
For example, when I have a bug in my test helpers reported by someone, firstly I write a unit test to reproduce this bug, and then I am fixing this bug. So this is already TDD, kind of TDD in
Okay.
my bug resolving technique.
Okay.
What kind of adoption of TDD are you seeing in the Drupal community?
Not so large as I wanted to see, because Drupal really depends on a lot of stateful configuration, database services, so it's not easy to uh, even not easy to imagine how you will write some functionality. So if you have some business task, for example, a simple calculator that calculates 2 plus 2, it's easy to imagine how you will write and how you will test it. But if you, for example, write a new, for example, comments module that can make some comments with images, you can't imagine how you will write it actually using Drupal API. So if you write the unit test, you should check a lot of things that you still can't imagine how will be implemented. And because of this, for the Drupal core and maybe many contributed modules, it's not easy to switch to the TDD. But when it comes to some logic, for example, if you write something to calculate or to sum up some information, you can simply describe this as a test, not even as a unit test, but just by words. So we're giving this information and getting this information, and this is already a kind of TDD approach. And then you
Yeah.
just try this as a code, and then start writing the code.
I think you kind of have to split this question into two though. Like, I think there's there's not a lot, but I think there's more people using test-driven development for client projects than in core, for example, right? I think Drupal has a really good relationship with testing in core, but you almost never see. In fact, I have never seen. Maybe Matt has. I've never seen an issue where somebody opened a merge request to fix a bug. The first commit was a test, and then the next commit was fixing the bug. People always fix the bug, and then the issue sits around forever waiting for a test.
I would say that's partially true, but one thing that Drupal.org has, because I used to do that, but then I hated wasting CI minutes for the Drupal Association, is we do have the test only CI jobs. So
Yes.
that is one thing unique to Drupal. So I have usually seen a lot of patches that are, yes, a lot of people don't write tests, but those who do, it usually is as one single patch because we have a test only option. So
Yep.
like that's one of the nice unique things about the Drupal infrastructure that I've always loved is you could do test driven development locally, push one giant patch, and then run a test only job to verify and do like TDD in the CI.
It's interesting.
But for fixing issues, for me, it's already easier to write maybe not unit test but functional test to reproduce the issue instead of clicking manually. For example, if someone reported problems when you click here, then put something here, click here, and we have unexpected output. For me, it's easier and quicker to write functional tests that do these clicks instead of checking manually. And then if we already have a failing test, I start to fix this.
So I'm curious on what makes test driven development different from other methods of development. I know there's lots of terms here, but I'm thinking when we built the new Google Tag module, we used test driven development for our unit and kernel test for verifying events. But then we also did behavior driven development using Nightwatch. So we had all of our tests that showed like the individual components work. But then to test actual Google Tag integration and Nightwatch's JavaScript testing framework, we used behavior-driven development. So I was wondering if you could speak on like how those two differ, how they're the same, or any other of the types of driven development there may be.
So if you have only test-driven development, it can't guarantee you that all is working as expected. So something like end-to-end tests or smoke tests still needed to check the core functionality that it's working because um, a single test just testing some separate function without other dependencies. And very often, if you change one line and the tests are okay, you deploy this to production and see a lot of surprises. So to get rid of this, you need some smoke tests that continuously checking. For example, if you have a e-commerce website, checking the cart, checking the order process, and other crucial functionality.
I think that something important to highlight too is that having tests and following test-driven development doesn't mean that you're going to produce bug-free code, right? Um, I think I think there's two big benefits, and feel free to add on to this, but I think one of those is it forces you, and you mentioned this earlier, Alex, it forces you to think about the logic before you start writing code, right?
Yeah.
It forces you to think about requirements before you start just writing functions and methods and stuff. And then the second thing, and this is, I think, uh, one of the biggest benefits of the test system in Drupal core is it helps prevent regressions. It doesn't completely prevent them, but it helps significantly more than just manual testing to prevent regressions because you have something automatically doing the same. You have a bug that you fixed 6 years ago that was only in this one specific situation that you've never seen again. It's not going to be top of mind when you're fixing a new bug next week, but the test is still going to run and check that. So if you fix a new bug next week and that breaks this other thing, well, you're not going to have a regression because now you have to go back and find out why that test is failing and fix it. So those are the two main benefits that I see. I don't, it's not going to produce bug-free code. Um, by any stretch,
Also,
which some people expect.
yeah,
I would say
yeah.
I'll say the one benefit is I absolutely hate manual testing in QA because it is slow and like it makes my skin crawl. So that's the one when I think of like the difference between like test driven development, behavior driven development is literally the test suite you're working with. Like I always feel like behavioral means I'm writing a test that acts as a user using the UI, and writing that test and having it automate a browser is so much faster than me clicking through, and also reduces me from making mistakes in that manual test plan, which
Yeah.
if an organization is lucky enough, they might have actual like quality assurance engineers who are really good at that job. But as a developer, I'm absolutely horrible. And that's like the main thing, is to help make their life easier too. So I think of it less as like for my own good, but just also for their own good, and just being able to ship faster in general.
And it's not just about speed either. It's also about the reproducibility aspect, right? Like one of the things that when you're manually testing, sometimes you create something, you update it to a point that's working, and you forget to delete that content and recreate the broken content or something, like, right? Whereas the test is going to be starting from the same place theoretically every single time, and so it makes sure that you're testing the actual bug. Um,
Yeah, I
but
also wanted to add about QA engineers, and even they can can join the test-driven development and produce some steps how to check this. Because when you have a task, you also should ask QA engineers to write test idea or steps how to test it, and these steps are exactly the idea of the unit test or functional test.
Mm.
So if you already have this written, you just need to write it into as steps in your test, and instead of manual testing, you have already to use test scenario. So for some manual QAs can become automated QA by just start writing these tests.
Hmm. That's actually an interesting question. How do you integrate and communicate these types of things to QA? Because even if you have a great test suite, you still want QA engineers to help out with some stuff, but you also don't want them necessarily clicking the same buttons that the test is.
You
So
do.
okay, for
Yeah, you do.
always.
I think QA should always be a black box, because you can't trust the
Hmm,
systems that you have built yourself. Because even if you do test driven development or whatever forms of testing, you're testing your own assumptions. And that assumption is how you wrote the code, how you expect
hmm,
Chrome to work, how you expect a headless Chrome to work, how your Linux CI server is working versus the production environment and their machine.
hmm,
Is I know like we have visual regression testing, but the visual regression testing, the screenshots look way different inside an Alpine Linux container with Chrome driver versus Mac OS
yeah,
and Chrome is like font rendering. So like
yep,
it's good to have that, but I believe like QA should be like a black box, just to, and for those who don't know, things like a black box, they don't know the internals. So they don't know what the testing is actually covering from the developer side. But the idea is that they will just test it, but they won't stub their toes along the way, because you're shipping well tested code, but they will help find the leaks that you didn't know existed.
interesting. Yeah, that's
Like,
probably a better philosophy.
yeah, Alex, I don't know if that's what your experience on that, but I know that's what I've always tried to follow.
But if this functionality is tested by the same QA manual QA engineer, it will do the same steps and the same misses from this test. So it's better to use just a random QA and give it the website and say, okay, let's order some products using our website. And if the user will be always new, it will make much better test than the manual QA engineer that doing the same steps 10 times every day for a month.
Yeah. I guess I think I know for our QA, we hand them like the user story, and they just go off the acceptance criteria and then create like mutations off of it, if you will. So like they'll
Hmm.
try to add in the oddball behavior. Where, like usually, like I haven't actually done mutation testing in unit testing. I'm sure that could be a whole talk on its own, but we try to just test the knowns and then do like best effort for testing, and then that's where like the manual QA kind of does a lot of that variant testing, I guess. So that could be one way to
Hmm.
think, like your tests cover the business logic, and then the manual QA isn't replicating the exact same steps, because yeah, that would be a lot of double effort, but just based off the user story accomplishing that, and then with some mutations along the way.
I'm so then presumably if they do some sort of mutation test and find an issue, send it back to you, that path ends up getting added to your unit test or functional tests, right? When you're fixing it, I would imagine. Is that the feedback loop?
Yeah. It's like go and
Okay.
add a new test. So think of it, and this is where you this is where it's like you know how they talk about agile is just waterfall at a smaller pace. Think of it that way. Like you get that
Hmm.
feedback, and then you're told the bug. Well, write a test case that is the bug, whether it's a unit test, kernel test, or like a browser based test. Verify the failing test, and then do the fix. Or if you can't get it to fail, then you can go straight to the QA and say, I couldn't replicate. Can you help me enhance the test case a little bit more? And then you have a dialogue. Whereas if you go and try to just fix the bug right away that QA said, like we're engineers, we like to sit and like dig in code. But what if you waste 3 hours fixing nothing because you have
Yeah.
no proof
Yeah.
besides what they said? The test helps provide the proof.
So I'm going to diverge a little bit further from the show, but I'm going to take advantage of both Matt and Alex's expertise here and ask a question that's this is something I've always struggled with, and it's related to testing. So, real world example, I have a client right now that's using it's a commerce site, which is probably near and dear to Matt's heart, and it's using Braintree and PayPal, and they occasionally have some sort of race condition or some sort of issue where PayPal just doesn't load. They can't continue to review because some failure happens when switching payment methods. I've not been able. I've seen it happen occasionally. I fixed a couple of bugs, but it's still occasionally happening, and I cannot figure out how to replicate it. Do you have any tips when you're writing a test for an issue like this where it's really hard to replicate, to kind of like just throw things at the wall to replicate it in order to narrow it down, or is it kind of like normal development where you just really got to keep working at it until you find the replication steps?
Mm, to find a way to reproduce the test, you should put some debug information into logs or use OpenTelemetry to have traces which will show you exactly what the source of the problem. For example, it can be a timeout from PayPal, or PayPal sometimes give you the response with missing field, for example. And if you catch the real source, you can create a mock of the PayPal service which reproduce this exact problem. And then you can write the unit test with this and prepare a fix. And you will be sure that if this problem will come again, you already tested this exception, and your functionality will work okay.
What were you going to say, Matt?
I would say that approach, and you should be able to in a test. I know I have it somewhere. When we did PayPal, Braintree, Square all have functional JavaScript tests, or at least somewhere they did, where we loaded it with like a test token to verify that it would mount with the module. You could do that and see if the test can rerun. I know Pest PHP has like a thing where you can say a test should rerun like 5 times in a row, so you could catch flaky tests. I can't remember if PHP Unit has this built in or not, or if it was like a layer on top. I know you can rerun like the entire test suite, but like I would write a test and see if it could rerun like 6 times in a row and see if it errors out. But then you got to try to like extract the browser logs from like the test, and like
Yeah.
that's hard. This is one of those where you can test all you want, but it breaks down. There's, I think it's in Kent Beck's test driven development book or somewhere else. He went to Facebook and was like, I write unit tests. Like, this is how it should go. And it's like they didn't write tests because they were doing so much in production that you couldn't even test what was happening because it was too abstract. And like it blew his mind.
Mm.
I might be misquoting, but something of that concept. This is where you can't really test it. You might be able to get it, but that's where you need to have like observability tools, like add roll bar
Yeah.
or sentry. So that way that you can track the console logs and say, oh, it's a race condition with mounting the SDK and the page wasn't fully loaded, or a browser
Yeah.
extension.
Well, I think that's what it was, because I found, like, I got lucky and found it once with a tool like that, and it was one. That's the frustrating thing about this particular thing. Before we get back to the show notes, is once like most things, you find the actual error. It's like a one line change took like 10 minutes to make and get that up, but replicating the issues, I've been working on it for for far too long now, trying to find that edge case. But yeah, I think maybe trying to run it multiple times. I suspect, just to kind of close this out, I suspect the issue actually isn't PayPal. I suspect that something with the checkout flow is throwing an error, and it's just preventing the continue to review from working. And I think it happens on the payment method switching. Some logic is failing there. So I don't even think it's actually PayPal. It's just people are trying to switch to PayPal that's failing. But anyway, yeah, that's all good
Mm.
advice.
By the way, I'm also a maintainer of the OpenTelemetry module that can integrate traces, logs, and metrics
Okay.
to Drupal. So you can combine them and get the full image of what's happening and what's failing.
Okay, I'm glad I asked. I'm curious. So it sounds like you have been doing test-driven development for a while. But if you think back to when you first started developing before you did test-driven development, what was kind of the biggest change you had to implement in your thinking when you started doing test-driven development to just, I guess, standard development previously?
I think for me it comes from fixing bugs. So if QA engineer describes 10 steps to reproduce this bug, I have to do this manually, then fix something, then do the steps again, and then I think about why I spending my time and hands to do this manually. So when we have a regression or something like this, I already started a long time ago started to write a test to reproduce this, and only then fix the code, and then having this idea, I also started to think about why do not do this when you write some new functionality, because it's the same and it simplifies the checking of the results. So instead of some debug output, you just run the test and it says, is it okay or not?
Okay. Well, to clarify, if it's a bug report, you do still manually verify that at least once, right? Like I imagine your first step isn't after getting a bug report is to write a test to check it, because I imagine that.
Mm,
Well,
I think pretty often I just start to writing or extending the already existing tests. For example,
mm,
and it's pretty often for Drupal core. So in Drupal core, if I have some bug, to report this bug, I need to put the steps to reproduce, and it's easier to write a failing unit test or a failing functional test instead of writing a lot of text manually. Click here, click there, check this, check that. So to report the bug, I prepare the failing unit test and then create the bug and only then starting to think how to fix it.
Yeah.
And
I
for other
would
developers who receive these bugs, it's also easier to fix it because they already have the test that's failing.
Yeah. I would agree with that. I've also had it where think of the time you spent manually reproducing the test or the failure. You could have probably written, and then you have to write the test. So you're doing double the work. And what if you write the test and it turned out to be like a false positive? There was just like an issue or as expected behavior. Well, now you have a test that you can commit. And I'm a big fan of doing that. If there's a bug reported, but it turns out to not really be a bug, well, you've just added another test to strengthen your application. So that it's not really time lost. If
Hmm.
anything, you gain time by not manually reproducing, manually writing the test. If you manually write the test, now let's say you work on that test for like 45 minutes, like time box it, and you can't reproduce the error. Maybe you should switch to like a manual testing to like say, okay, I'm not writing the test right, but it can save time because you're not doing double effort.
Interesting. I've never considered that before.
So, if anyone is interested in learning test-driven development, what are some good learning resources?
Actually, I started to just started to write unit tests without any specific literature, and then when I face some issue, I just use search engines to find answers, and some random articles help me resolve specific questions, specific problems, and then step by step, just became a professional in unit tests and in the other tests. And also looking to other tests is also a good help to write your own tests. So if you have a module that do kind of the same thing that you do, you can open their tests and do the same in your environment.
Matt, you had mentioned the test-driven development book. Is there anything else that you would recommend too?
I can't think of any.
No.
I would say I definitely read the book after I found test-driven development, so kind of like Alexei, and I was like, I'm gonna get the book and like read it, and it's just a fascinating read because it's just like it's short. I have it. I keep looking over because it's on my bookshelf. It's like an inch thick or so. Like it's not a very big book, but it's practical. You can like sit on a plane ride or a train ride and quick read through it and get that refresher of, oh, this is why I'm doing this. The idea of like, oh, the test helped me write cleaner code. Um, and it might help with that paradigm shift as well. And then otherwise it's just doing it by practice. I feel like in practice, you kind of get a feel for it because it will be awkward at first and you feel like you're not saving time. But then once you start doing it, you're like, oh, why wasn't I doing this before? Which I'm curious, Alexei, what pointers do you have to give anyone that's looking to start with test-driven development? Because I I know my answer is just start trying it, and that's not a great approach.
Actually, from my side, the same. So just force yourself to write a test before write the code. It's very hard to start, but when you will get some success stories with your code, you will start thinking more about this, and someday you will see that you are right. You are using the TDD approach instead of the classic one.
I think that is like the only way. It's just you have to try it out. I know at our team, it's kind of been enforced because we have a requirement that code coverage has to be at 80% or 85% for all new code. So like your diff has to be covered at least 85%. And after a while of writing code, forgetting to do the test or seeing that your code coverage is like 50% because you forgot like this one logic branch, that kind of enforces a bit of like the test driven development as well. When you set that gate, again, code coverage, not the perfect metric, but it kind of helps say and show that visibility of like, oh, we didn't actually test everything. Or maybe I could write the code to be more performant because I don't need all these extra steps that are never testable or things of that sort.
Yeah, it also can help you find some dead code that never called.
Exactly. Yeah. You might have written a bunch of code and then turns out like, oh, I don't actually ever need this because it's never executed.
Yeah.
I'm curious about what other maybe non-technical skills can contribute to a team that's looking to switch to test-driven development. What can be helpful for, the QA team or team leads or that kind of thing to help a help a developer team adopt TDD?
I think QA specialists and business analysts are good candidates to start writing the idea of the test. So not writing the technical requirements with several pages of literature text, but just write the test ideas and test scenarios. So this input should produce this output, this input this, and if we have this input, we should fail. Should throw the exception. So they are good candidates and can make very meaningful work for developers. So developers will understand much easier these things instead of text, just text describing the idea of what do the business wants.
Do you think it's difficult? Do you find it difficult to work with the business side to start communicating that method, or is it something that once they see that it translates to a better project, that it kind of is natural and they start communicating requirements that way just generally?
I think it simplifies understanding of the whole thing what we are doing. So if a customer wants to implement new functionality, usually they say, okay, we want this cool thing, please do it. But when you start asking about how it will work, what it will produce, how it should work with some unexpected input, the customer already starts thinking about this good and bad scenarios, and it generates for you the technical requirements instead
Yeah.
of business analysts.
Are there certain kinds of projects that are better suited to test-driven development?
I think many projects that do a lot of calculations or some reproducible job, some step-by-step job that can be easily checked. And I don't know, some different calculations or working with data comes to my mind, but something easy when you create a website, just a homepage with simple text, it can't be used in test-driven development because you just doing the design, you put your HTML and CSS, and that's it. And this kind of websites are needed to use the classic approach instead of TDD.
Let's say, like, that's one thing to keep in mind. You're inheriting a level of trust when you use Drupal or a framework that has its own unit tests. It's like, why unit test? I try to avoid unit testing things that I know are provided by the framework, and that should just work. In this case, you have a homepage. You shouldn't re-unit test the entire render system of Drupal for your homepage that you're styling, because you're using a stable software that's supposed to be tested. It's like, use best judgment.
And actually, test helpers does this thing, so you can call the render the function that calls the renderer service, and you will receive not the final output because you have no theme, no information about this, but you will receive the render array, and you can check this array with all includes, with all inner functions that add something to this. And you're checking not the final HTML code, but the actual data that will come to the tweak template. And using this, you can check the design, the draft of the design that will be displayed to the user. So this is also a good approach to get rid of some render issues.
Interesting.
And the same with cache tags. So you can check the cache tags. For example, if you render some nodes, you can see that the node IDs are present in the render array.
That's really fascinating. I'm curious if you ever see test helpers getting into core, or if it's just you, or at least pieces of it, or do you think it just stays in contrib? Because it sounds like it's the layer between core and contrib. I don't think it really makes sense to be put into core directly, but I wonder if that's something you've thought about.
This is the idea that I had when I started Test Helpers. Before my idea was to contribute to Drupal core and put some helpers to the core, but actually I thought that this is not not easy to implement and to describe what they are doing and why we should include this. Then I decided to create a contrib module, a separate module that implements the things. And I still have an idea to create patches to move some functionality to the core, because I see a lot of functional tests in core that can be easily replaced by unit tests and will speed up the pipelines for Drupal core. So moving this is not technically impossible. It's quite easier to move this to core, but the most complex thing is to describe to Drupal core developers that this is a good approach, because I'm converting unit tests to some mix of functional and unit tests. And this breaks the classic logic of unit tests. And because of this, I think it will be very problematic to put it to the core.
Hmm.
And just for start, I want to create mocks for some popular services. So not the full test helpers, but just, for example, mock the entity query, because when we are covering entity query, I will see a lot of just mocks to make the 100% coverage instead of checking the logic. Okay, we have an entity query and it executes, and we produce the output result, but we usually don't check which fields, which values it uses to retrieve the values. But with test helpers, we can check the exact fields, the exact values that are produced to run the entity query. And this actually creates a more stable test that checks a lot of things, not mock the results, but check the actual entity query and sorting and other things.
Yeah, it's interesting because it introduces some problems, right? But it also solves others. I mean, one of the
Yeah.
things that I can see it introducing, although this is something that you ultimately would want, like if a bug gets introduced with entity query, you're now calling that service, and if an exception is thrown, now your code isn't going to work and your test will fail, even though it has nothing to do with something that you did. Although you want to know that because now the end result is the same for the end user, right? The thing on the page is not working.
Yeah.
But it can maybe in some cases obfuscate why that's failing. But yeah, no, that's definitely interesting. Yeah, I think it would be hard to get that into core, but who
Yes.
knows? The core team is coming up with some new policies for tests. I don't know if you saw this, but a new issue just got put in saying that certain issues can be solved without tests. There's some pretty strict guidelines for when that is, and they're still trying to figure out exactly what those are. But one of the things that they're trying to solve for is these really simple one-line logic fixes that just get stuck in the queue for 15 years because writing a test for it is almost impossible. And you know, and people are churning for years and years trying to figure out how to write a test when it's like, you know, this is saying, 2 is not equal to 2 and it should be 2 is equal to 2. And it's very obvious to everybody looking at it. That's what it's supposed to be. And there's been a patch since, 2008. It's just that nobody can figure out how to test that particular logic. And then there's like 25 duplicate tickets because occasionally somebody else finds it and goes, oh, this will be an easy fix, opens a duplicate ticket, fixes it, and then finds out that the fix is impossible to test. So maybe with the new approach to testing, maybe there's some flexibility in the next couple of years to kind of get something like Test Helper at least partially into core as well. Because from my perspective, anything that can make the test writing easier would be a huge win for the community. Because like we've been talking about this whole show, testing is where issues go to die in core. People write a fix, and then they just either don't have the capability or the time, inclination to write the test, and it just sits there with the patch forever or with the merge request forever. But if there's a way to like very quickly spin up tests that's more colloquial because the helpers are providing all that infrastructure, I think that'd be a huge win.
So what you're saying is, if you like writing tests, you can go on Drupal.org and look at the needs test issue tag, and you have a treasure trove of contribution possibilities,
Absolutely.
along with getting better test helpers in core.
Yes. What was that called? Needs tests queue?
Yes, there's a needs test tag.
Yeah.
Speaking of folks not necessarily like writing tests or like getting used to it, I know I briefly touched on how my team has adapted, but how have you gotten dev teams to adapt to test-driven development on your projects?
No, it's pretty complex to adapt the whole team because you should show good examples about how it works and what benefits it gives. But a lot of developers want to use their classic approach and think that this modern hype is just a hype, not not actually the benefit. It's just to ask more money from customers and to be a modern developer instead of real profit. And actually, in some cases, TDD produce a lot of additional work, a lot of additional discussions, and maybe you can use classic approach and spend 10 times less time to implement the thing. So you should be flexible and ask to use TDD only where it really should give some benefits, not just okay from tomorrow we doing all only with the TDD approach and no other ways are allowed.
Okay.
And then step by step, you will convert your whole workflow to the TDD from the first easy and most beneficial steps to all the steps.
One of the things that I've always been thinking about, I've been thinking about as we've been talking about this, I think we all agree test-driven development is better. It's not, you know, the simplest thing, right? There's some things that, Drupal coding standards adopts and is dead simple, right? Thinking back a few years, switching from the word array parenthesis to a bracket, right? Dead simple. You make that decision, you just start doing it. Testing requires some infrastructure to set up. And I know test helpers helps with that. But if I'm starting a new project and I decide I'm going to do this project test driven development, I sit down, I have my first requirement, I'm ready to write my first test. It's not going to work. Like I need some infrastructure to run those tests, at least locally. What resources can you recommend to a developer to get their local environment set up for testing a custom project that they're writing, like a custom module?
Mm, for writing unit tests locally, you can just use instructions from Drupal.org, and if your system doesn't allow or it doesn't work, you can use some container, for example. The dev project can produce you environment in Docker containers with any setup that you want, any PHP version, any libraries versions, and ready to use Drupal. So to install Drupal and the contrib module, you just need to run several commands, copy paste them from Drupal.org, and you already have a working instance to launch unit tests. And you can check this by launching the Drupal core unit tests, and if they working okay, then you have ready to use environment to write your unit tests.
I generally agree with that. I would say it does take a little bit of setup, both for like for example, the documentation is very good for example setting up DDEV with core testing, but occasionally things do break. So you do need to be prepared to test things. Like for example, core test stopped working for me last week for some reason, and it turns out because I think it switched to 8.3 and DDEV hadn't updated to using 8.3 for that particular project for that particular instance of Drupal core that I was using. And so it can occasionally take some work. I think if you're testing within a project, like within a Drupal project for custom code, it's easier than a custom module, because a custom module requires, there's like a GitLab container you can use that runs stuff, but it ends up like installing Drupal outside of it so it can run the PHP unit kind of functionality that it needs. But I just want to call out that it can take a little bit of effort to get set up. But I think it's one of those things, once you do, it's generally there. It's not something you have to maintain all that often. And like you said, there's some resources that we'll have in the show notes for how to find those.
And by the way, when Drupal.org adds GitLab, GitLab can provide launching the VS Code inside browser and launch unit tests there instead of your local environment. So you can just commit changes and then open the VS Code in your browser and launch tests there. Never tried it actually, but it should work.
Interesting. Yeah.
And we can use Gitpod for this. So for contributed modules, it's easier to launch tests and to check something, because they are modules that has no dependencies on the customer code. But if you have a project, you have a lot of dependencies on other services, on some specific maybe databases, microservices, and this can give you a lot of problems with launching and reproducing unit tests locally.
So before we wrap, Alex, are there any special tools that you would recommend that can help with test-driven development?
I think just standard tools like PHP unit and what else? It can show you the coverage, and personally I use VS Code with some plugins that can show the code coverage and the lines that are covered or not just directly in your IDE. And that's it. So just run PHP unit or use VS Code interface to launch the tests, and that's it. So no specific software is needed.
Well, Alexey, thank you for joining us to talk to us about test-driven development today. It's been a pleasure learning about all the benefits and how we can get started doing that in our personal projects.
Thank you for giving that opportunity to share my experience with the Talking Drupal and the whole Drupal community, I hope.
Absolutely.
Do you have questions or feedback? Reach out to Talking Drupal on Twitter with the handle Talking Drupal, or by email with show@talkingdrupal.com. You can connect with our hosts and other listeners on Drupal Slack in the Talking Drupal channel.
And you can promote your Drupal community event on Talking Drupal. Learn more at talkingdrupal.com/TD promo.
Get the Talking Drupal newsletter to learn more about our guest host, show news, upcoming shows, and much more. Sign up for the newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter.
And thank you, patrons, for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and choosing the Become a Patron button. All right, Alex, if our listeners want to get in touch with you, had any questions about the test module that you wrote or test-driven development in general, what's the best way for our listeners to get in touch with you?
I think just create an issue, support issue on the Drupal.org, or you can find me in Slack to ask questions. So I will be happy to help. And for bugs, you just create an issue on Drupal.org with steps to reproduce, and I will be happy to fix it.
With the test first.
Yeah, the test first.
And Matt, how about you? How can our listeners get in touch with you?
You can go to my website, mglaman.dev, to use my contact form or find links to all my socials.
All right. And Martin, how can our listeners get in touch with you?
On all the social and Drupal channels, they can find me as Mandclue.
And listeners can find me pretty much everywhere at Nixvan, Nicxvan.
If you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking.
See you guys next week.